Asia, and also Prof. The speaker tonight, Prof. Osman Bakar, and the rest of my colleagues all over the world. We have Prof. Osman, we have 87 participants, or 88 now, and we have this brother as far as Brother Farhad from Toronto, Canada. He visited you in ISTAC. So before I introduce Prof. Osman Bakar and make some introduction, why don't we begin our session tonight with recitation Al-Fatiha. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Ar-Rahmanir-Rahim. Iyyakum nasta'in mustaqim siratal ladzina maghdubi 'alaihim. Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah, summa alhamdulillah. All praise to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Tonight we are very fortunate to have IIIT online intellectual discourse series number 22. After we have a break for 2 months, now we start with number 22, and we have prominent scholars with us, Professor Datuk Osman Bakar, and we'll discuss on Al-Ghazali and Ibn Rushd, 2 stars in the intellectual galaxy of Islam. So, and we're fortunate to have our own star with us, Professor Osman Bakar himself. And before I start, I will introduce, I will make an introduction for who's Al-Ghazali. And of course, Professor Osman will elaborate more. The famous 11th and 20th centuries, 12th centuries, Al-Ghazali was the first occupant of the chair of Shafi'i law at the leading Nizamiya University in Baghdad, which at the time was the equivalent of Al-Azhar. And Ibn Rushd himself, better known as a competitor of Aristotle, was credited with several medical works, including medical encyclopedia entitled Book or Generalities of Medicine. He also wrote commentaries of Ibn Sina medical work. And both of Ibn Rushd and Al-Ghazali acknowledge the importance of Al-Quran as essential guide for anyone who wants to live a meaningful and fulfilling and productive life. And before I would like to invite Professor Bakar, I would like to introduce, of course, everybody knows we have 113 participants, Prof, currently with us all over the world, from Canada, Africa, Cambodia, Indonesian, and all over the world. And now an honor for me to introduce Professor Dr. Osman Bakar, a distinguished professor at ISTAC, International Islamic University of Malaysia. He was Al-Ghazali Chair of Epistemology and Civilizational Studies. He was formerly director of Sultan Omar Ali Al Saifuddin Center of Islamic Studies at University of Brunei Darussalam. He's concurrently Emeritus of Professor of Philosophy of Science, University of Malaya, Kuala Lumpur. He has published 22 books and over 300 articles on Islamic thought and civilization, particularly on Islamic philosophy and science. He also writes on contemporary Islam and interreligious and inter-civilizational dialogue. His writing has been translated into many languages. He has served as advisor and consultant to a variety of international academic and professional organizational institutions, including UNESCO and Qatar Foundation. He served as Deputy Vice Chancellor of University of Malaya in 1995, year 2000. He was included in the list of 500 most influential Muslims in the world in 2009 and 2012. Without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Osman Bakar. The virtual world is your floor. Tafadhal, Prof.
Thank you, Brother Professor Fauzan, the moderator, Brother Shahran, IIIT East Asia, and all friends from various parts of the world. I greet you all. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Salam sejahtera, peace be unto you, Of course, depending on where you are, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. Thank you to IIIT for inviting me to give this short lecture. Let me explain to you the background of this lecture. Some time ago, it was, I think, Professor Fauzan who forwarded an article from Pakistan.
Yes.
It was an article in which the writer talks about the how, in a sense, the difference between Al-Ghazali and Ibn Rushd, as the author taking the side referred to the controversy between the two figures, and he took the side of Ibn Rushd, criticizing, on the other hand, Al-Ghazali as someone who was responsible for the decline of science and intellectual life in Islam. And because of that article, I made some comments, and then I think some of the members of another group, WhatsApp group, thought that it might be a good thing if a lecture be held on the subject, because there's so much misunderstanding, so much misconception, and also the false, basically, things that are not factual about the history of Islamic thought. So I took up the offer by IIIT to make this, to give this lecture. And of course, once agreeing to talk about these two, how should I phrase the topic? So I came up with this topic, Al-Ghazali and Ibn Rushd, two stars in the intellectual galaxy, or the intellectual galaxy of Islam. The idea, and it was deliberate on my part why I use those terms. First, of course, when to use the word galaxy, I could have make it smaller in scope, talks about the universe, but I thought it even bigger, so as to embrace more things, more diverse things within the Islamic history itself, because basically the idea is that I would like to accept both of them as two important figures in Islamic intellectual history, and not just question of saying that I would like to choose either one, but that does not correspond to the true reality in Islamic intellectual history. Now, that was the background of this lecture. Now, we know very well that the religion of Islam, as contained in the Quran and in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, created a large intellectual universe of ideas. Since the beginning of the religion until now, after more than 14 centuries, especially during those periods, those centuries when we used to call Islam at its best, when Islam was at its best, when Islam was its most creative phase of its history. Islam produced many intellectual figures, many thinkers, many scholars, and certainly now we have with us Al-Ghazali and Ibn Rushd, not simply two stars, but two of the brightest stars in the intellectual galaxy of Islam. Yes, there were similarities between them, a lot of similarities. In fact, there are more similarities between them than that divide them. But the way some people among both Muslims, as well as those from outside in the West, for example, who like enough want us to make a choice, either Al-Ghazali or Ibn Rushd. But my approach is that both of them belong to the religion of Islam, and both of them believe in the Quran, believe in the Sunnah, believe in the principle of ijma, consensus, as a source of knowledge, a concept which Ibn Rushd referred to when he wanted to respond to those who want to doubt the philosophers of which he was one, as opposed against Islam, as going against Islam. Especially those who want to, of course, include reference to Al-Ghazali. He tried to bring that idea that there's no consensus on that. When it comes to doctrines, there's no consensus that the philosophers were outside the fold of Islam. So, what I'm saying now here, because we study the universe, the intellectual universe, Islam was so large, there's bound to be a lot of diversity. Cannot expect within such a large intellectual universe to find uniformity of thought. What is important is whether the ideas, the thoughts which were had, which were in sense emphasized by each of the two thinkers, were contrary to the Quran and the Sunnah or not. Well, my life devoted to Islamic philosophy, Islamic intellectual thought, I didn't see that way. I saw both of them as being true ulama. They were true ulama. They were real ulama in the sense and the real sense of the word. In the sense that people who have knowledge, deep knowledge, the people, the two who knew very well the Quran, who knew very well the Sunnah, who knew very well also the history of pre-Islamic civilization, especially the Greek civilization. So it is important to take note of that. In fact, if you look at the two, they were both trained in the religious sciences, the sciences of the Sharia. They were trained also, but in different ways, they were exposed to in the intellectual sciences, what has been familiarized in Islam, what we call the Naqli sciences, or the Al-Ulum, Al-Naqliya, the transmitted sciences, basically coinciding at the core, which basically is the sciences of the Sharia. And then you have also the other branch, the major category of the sciences, what we call the intellectual sciences or the rational sciences, referring to the Al-Ulum, Al-Aqliya. So both Al-Ghazali, or the Ghazali's earlier background was the sciences of the Sharia, the Naqli sciences, but later he learned the different philosophical sciences. Not on the same level as Ibn Rushd, but in the case of Ibn Rushd, the same thing. He was familiar in both categories of sciences. He was also trained as as I said, in the sciences of the Sharia. He became the Chief Justice, Chief Qadi in Cordoba, and the moderator just now referred that he was the great commentator of Aristotle. But as I said, there are more things in common. than differences. But in Islamic intellectual thought, of course, I mean, we have many different schools. We have school, the legal school. Al-Ghazali belonged to the Shafi'i school, and Ibn Rushd belonged to the Maliki school. But they were knowledgeable in the Sharia. And Al-Ghazali, of course, I mean, he was a theologian of the, in the sense, the belonging to the school of Kalam, one of the Mutakallimun. He belonged to the Ansharite school. Of course, in the case of Ibn Rushd, I mean, he does not belong to that school because he belongs to the school of the philosophers, the philosophers, the peripatetic school, the Mashai school, by which we mean he belonged to the school of the Muslim followers of Aristotle. Aristotle has followers among Jewish and Christian philosophers, but among the Muslims, we have Al-Kindi, we have Al-Farabi, we have Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd. All these belong to the peripatetic school. But what distinguished Ibn Rushd from the others, because of his rational stance, I think this is where the misunderstanding. Yeah? The misunderstanding that because he was a kind of rationalist, you know, and therefore he was against certain tenets of Islam. But I don't find that the case. To me, yes, he was. He may be called a Muslim rationalist, Islam follower, exponent of Islamic rationalism. But we need to bear in mind that in the world of his time and even now, there were many schools of rationalism. And certainly it is legitimate to say then there is such a thing as Islamic rationalism. And basically when we say rationalism, we're dealing about ideas, beliefs, perspectives about the place and role of reason in our life and thought. And to say that, for example, Ibn Rushd makes more use of reason, than more rational than Al-Ghazali. That would be not entirely correct, but certainly Ibn Rushd emphasized the use of reason much more than Al-Ghazali, or we can say that the philosophers emphasize the role of reason in a more in a wider scope than, say, the Mutakallimun. But that itself does not mean that one is more Islamic than the other. And what's important to note that is within the universe of Islam, what the principle that was maintained was the harmony between reason and revelation. No Muslim philosopher would say that reason stands above revelation. Wahyu, no. The philosophers also maintain that revelation is superior to reason. But where they differ is basically about the scope given to the use of reason. So in this respect, you can say that the philosophers emphasize the reason in much more ways, so that, for example, the difference between Al-Ghazali and Ibn Rushd concerns the place of reason in the attainment of truth. So Ibn Rushd emphasized that reason is the main instrument, emphasized much more, whereas Al-Ghazali was talking also about the other sources of truth apart from reason, a kind of emphasizing the supra-rational experience. For example, on the organ, on the intellectual organ or the cognitive organ of the pulse, the heart. In other words, the heart is another cognitive organ that was emphasized. And in the case of Ghazali, therefore, the emphasis, you have to understand that context. For example, the legitimacy, the rationale for the purification of the soul or purification of the heart, precisely because there is a very important source to knowledge. So it's a question of emphasis of one over the other. And therefore here, when we see arguments or claims made by some people within Islam, among Muslims, or outside the fold of Islam, from some thinkers in the West, making the choice, I think the claims are made because they do not really look at the total picture of the thinking of these two people. Let's say, for example, Al-Ghazali. The thing is, Al-Ghazali as the author of Tahafud al-Falasifa, the incoherence of the philosophers, is even criticized. It's not, or was not, the same Al-Ghazali, for example, who wrote books, Munkis min al-Dalal, or who wrote Risalah al-Laduni, or Mishkatul Anwar. It's two different Al-Ghazali. Because why was that so? This is something which we need to understand. The emphasis in traditional Islam was that, in the sense that intellectuals belong, generally, not everybody, but generally, of course there were exceptions, generally the intellectuals belong to a particular school, and some belong to more than one school, because within themselves as a single individual, they played different roles. Let's say Al-Ghazali, he was a faqih, he was a jurist, and not simply a jurist, an excellent one, a formidable one. Then he was also, in other words, he belonged to the school, the legal school, the legal scholar. But in terms of seeking truth, the truth, in terms of ideas, three other schools were important. He was a mutakallim. In other words, he was a dialectical theologian. So, when he wrote Tahafud al-Falasifa, he wrote that work from the perspective of Kalam, not from the perspective of fiqh, not from the perspective of, well, of course, at the time when he wrote, he did not study, when he wrote that book, of course, he was just learning philosophy, but he was not really full-fledged Sufi, say not in part, but he was mutakallimun, but he learned philosophy by himself. He did not have a teacher in philosophy, but he understood philosophy, the practical philosophy, to the extent that he was able to produce the maqasid al-falasifa, the aims of the purposes of the philosophers very well. He read very well. He understood that. So he was, but he wrote, or rather he wrote that book, the Tahafud al-Falasifa, the incoherence of the philosophers, as a mutakallim. Therefore, so what is the perspective of this? It is basically to defend. It's basically to defend the beliefs, the beliefs of the ordinary believers. Because during that time we saw some of the streams of ideas that among the philosophers who might be misunderstood, who might mislead the ordinary believers. So that, of course, was meant more to refute. It was a refutation rather than an affirmation of the kind of beliefs that he held. But just to show that, all right, you philosophers, you are claiming this thing, But I'm going to write now to refute against you. Just to show that the methods, the arguments you use are fallible and not infallible. Means that was the idea. But to express what he actually believed, then we have to go to his other book. So you see, I think this it's important to observe that. And of course, later on, he left the Nizamiya University in Baghdad to lead a Sufi life. He left his the Ghazali chair, the chair of the Shafi'i chair, the Shafi'i chair in Baghdad, chair of Shafi'i law. He became convinced that there were other ways. In other words, there were other paths to truth. He appealed to supra-rational experience. He became one of the important Sufis. In other words, there a lot of his books, which were written from the perspective of Sufism. The most important, of course, is the magnum opus, is the Hiyar-ud-Din, which is a very important work of Sufi ethics, a work of Sufi ethics. Whereas Ibn Rus was talking about a school of ethics, and a perspective on ethics, not Sufi ethics, but the ethics of the philosophers. The kind of ethics that Ibn Rus was talking about, more the Aristotelian ethics, ethics based on rational investigation, rational approach, whereas in the case of Al-Ghazali is looking more to kind of the inner experience, the inner transformation, the people who are knowledgeable in the Ilmul Mukashafa, the science of the unveiling. So it's different way of experiencing truth. This is important because the Quran talks about three different kinds of certainty: certainty of knowledge, ilmu yaqeen, certainty of knowledge, then the certainty of vision, which is the ainul and yaqeen, and the other one is the haqqul yaqeen. In sense, the person who became spiritual extinct, who became extinct for an experience state of fana in God. So the Sufis were very, very interested in this kind of spiritual experience, which is maybe called super-rational, without negating, or without rendering illegitimate what was accepted previously. So that's why Al-Ghazali is saying to the Asqas, to the Mutakallimun, he criticized his fellow Mutakallimun themselves. Okay? Although I come from the same school, but there are things which I don't agree, he said, with regard to philosophy, because yes, there are things that he cannot accept from the philosophers, but there are many other things like logic, mathematics, and so on. There's nothing wrong with that. So why should we reject that? With that kind of attitude, Al-Ghazali became, in a sense, to me, one thing that to remember about Al-Ghazali is that he created a synthesis, basically, a synthesis of Kalam, philosophy, and Sufism. He created that synthesis in his thought. So this this kind of synthesis to be found later in, for example, in Ibn Arabi. So coming back to this, we talk about similarities and differences between Al-Ghazali and Ibn Rushd. We realize the importance, each role, each of them played in the history, not only in the history of Islam, but even so in the history of the West. In their time, I'm talking about 11th century, see, from 10th century, 12th century, 13th century, one way of showing that you are somebody, you are famous, is to see whether you have a Latin name. So if you have a Latinized name, then you might be famous, you know. So that's why in the rules and so on, the Averroes, she was known as Averroes, and of course the most influential, the most famous of the Muslim thinkers in the Latin world. And even Al-Ghazali also has a Latinized name, Al-Ghazali. So both of them were known to the West. But unfortunately, I think in the case, especially of Ibn Rushd, he was misunderstood in the Latin West. So that's why the appreciation shown by people in the West since then until modern times, not exactly correct. I refer to the one person. I like very much the writing of this Harry Wolfson. Harry Wolfson, who a scholar of Kalam, basically, the modern scholar about Kalam. Yeah, he wrote many works, you know, about Kalam, and he talked about the twice revealed Averroes. What he meant that Ibn Rushd was misunderstood twice in the West. What was in what sense was he misunderstood? Now, the first time he was misunderstood, but the first misunderstanding about Ibn Rushd was done. He believed, according to this critic, or rather according to these people who were his fans, that Ibn Rushd believed in two truth theory, namely the truth of revelation and the truth of reason, the double truth theory that was known in the West. But that's what Ibn Rushd was perceived by some people in the West, and through them, through their influence later, even a small number of modernized Muslims who thought, who gave the same kind of appreciation of Ibn Rushd. But it's not correct. You don't find in the writings of Ibn Rushd this idea of two truth, two parallel truth. One, the truth based on revelation, and another truth based on reason. On the contrary, Ibn Rushd believed in one truth, but there are two different ways of expressing this truth. One is through revelation, the other is reason. And Ibn Rushd wrote a work, the Fasul Maqal في بين الحكمة والشريعة من اتصال. Which has been translated loosely. I think that which translated literally means the unity of it has been translated by some as the unity of religion, religion and philosophy. But we have to be careful again when we use term, because when we use the word religion, the harmony of religion and philosophy, the unity of religion and philosophy, we may give certain meanings to religion, certain meanings to philosophy, and then it could lead to misleading conclusion. We should use the word used by Ibn Rushd. What were the words that he used in Arabic? Well, the word used in Arabic, which was used which translated into English as religion, was Sharia. Now, it is important to realize that Sharia is not equal to religion. And furthermore, when you use the word religion, on the other hand, you do religion starting from English, then people start to talk about what's the religion? It's talking about deen. You see, it's both ways. It's both ways. If you say from Arabic translated into English, so actually what was translated was a Sharia and translated into religion. You may agree or you may not agree with that, but the point is we have another word for religion, which is deen. Certainly, the word used by Ibn Rushd was not deen, but translated in English as religion. And the other one is, of course, philosophy. Ibn Rus did not use the word falsafa, but he used the word hikmah. Of course, in Islamic literature, both hikmah and falsafa have been translated into philosophy. But there's a subtle thing about this, because after Al-Ghazali especially, the word falsafa became less used compared to the word hikmah. Hikmah became a more widespread, is the word used more widely than hikmah. As commented by some Muslim scholars, it showed that, it showed that somehow the Islamic perspective of philosophy has become more entrenched. So even at the level of terminology, people do use the word philosophy, but hikmah, to make it conform to the Quranic usage of the word. So, whereas Ibn Rus talk about the harmony between, of course, he used the word the ittisal, in other words, use the harmony. But the translation from instance that he talk about, basically he talk about the unity of hikmah and sharia, whereas in the English translation, it's talk about the harmony between religion and philosophy. You can see that, where at what point that differences, or rather misunderstanding or misleading consequences, or the different consequences can lead from purely the question of terminology. But the point is, in the case of Ibn Rus, he did not talk about the truth of the Sharia and the truth of philosophy. On the contrary, he talks about the convergence, the unity of the two. That's important, and therefore the idea of his fans in the West, especially his fan club in the Latin world. I mean, Ibn Rus was so popular in the West, he had a fan club among Western thinkers, just like nowadays the Muslims fan club. It's not more fan club of singers and football rather than fan club of thinkers in the West, but in case of at that time, Ibn Rus has a fan club. People, but then he was misunderstood. Yeah, they like him for the wrong reason. The Western thinkers like him for the wrong reason, thinking that he really, he believed that reason lead to different kind of truth, not the same truth with which we associate with revelation. And in the case of the other thing, misunderstanding about Ibn Rus was that Ibn Rus was anti-religious because of the three issues that he brought up. That certainly the 3 points on which in which Al-Ghazali raised the matter. There is the 3 issues on which he charged that the philosophers were dubbed as having committed kufr because belief in the eternity of the world, belief in that the question of God not knowing particulars, the question of the reception of these were 3 issues that were that saw that the theologians or Al-Ghazali was encountering. But these are difficult issues. These are difficult issues, and but in my own thing, I do not see, because there's some misunderstanding also on the part of Al-Ghazali on what he thought the philosophers were saying with regard to these 3 issues. And when we have to, I think for us now, it is important that when we want to differentiate between the two, we need to go to the original sources. the original sources of these scholars, not depending on second-hand views, because this question, for example, I think people parroting, people just repeating what others have said without any basis. On the one, with regard to Al-Ghazali, they say Al-Ghazali is to be accused, is responsible for the decline of science, and people talk about a showdown between Al-Ghazali and Ibn Rushd, as if that they met each other and they lived at the same time, contemporaries, living contemporaries. But that's not the case. I mean, they forgot that, Al-Ghazali died in 1111. Yeah, whereas Ibn Rushd was born only in 1126, right? Later only then. So how can you see that one scholar, American scholar, who was of course very critical of Al-Ghazali, said he mentioned the showdown between Al-Ghazali and Ibn Rushd. I thought the showdown, for example, you see the cowboy film, The High Noon, the hero and the bad guy drawing pistol. But it's not. I mean, Ibn Rushd was not drawing pistol against Ibn Rushd, because Al-Ghazali was already in the grave, no? Ibn Rushd, basically, because Ibn Rushd responding to Al-Ghazali without actually able to reply back. Possibly, if Al-Ghazali was still alive, he would have said, if he wrote the Tahafut al-Falasifa, Ibn Rushd wrote Tahafut al-Tahafut, so maybe he will write another one, Tahafut al-Tahafut. The Tahafut al-Philosophers, but that was the case. So what happens that some people who try to interpret Al-Ghazali, who want to interpret Ibn Rushd, so it's their interpretation who make the difference between the two look, very, 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 very large, they kind of divided too far. I think, but that was not the case. Certainly, I think my own study of the history of Islamic science and Islam, it would be wrong to say that Al-Ghazali that knockout to science. And it's as if that science was demolished by Al-Ghazali and never recover or something. But that wasn't the case. Yeah? What was true was that philosophy took a new form because of the critique of Al-Ghazali of the peripatetic philosophy of the Mashaykh school. Philosophy in Islam took a different form. Not only, of course, on the outside, as it just not terminology, turned to hikmah, but then philosophy was not just based on reason, but based also upon other sources. That is important to realize. Then my own study that after Al-Ghazali, in different branches of science, there was steady progress rather than decline, especially in astronomy. If you refer to the works of George Saliba, an Arab Christian, he's not Arab, but not a Muslim. He's a leading scholar today on Islamic astronomy. For him, the golden age of Islamic astronomy was after Al-Ghazali, for example, right? And my own study of the Qutb ibn Shirazi, for example, a follower of Ibn Sina in philosophy, but a great scientist, and he revived together with Nasiruddin Tusi the science of optics. He revived that. In other words, during that time, the knowledge of physics and optics in particular. But what is to be noted is that revival in the science of optics, not for scientific reason, but more for philosophical reason, especially more for, because of physics, of philosophy and metaphysics, that led to that. In other words, based on in other words, it was the burst of light in the Quran, for example, the metaphysics of light that led to the blossoming of the science of optics, not empirical consideration, but metaphysical consideration. So it's different thing altogether. if you are to believe what these critics of Al-Ghazali, then you won't find that kind of situation in the history of Islam. So long after Al-Ghazali, science continued to be cultivated. Of course, it's not the same, maybe not the same, not all the same branches of science as were to be found during the time of Al-Ghazali. But the point is that it is not true that science kept declining due to the knockout, the philosophical knockout by Al-Ghazali. It is this kind of thing that I feel, and I would like to say, right? In other words, that for Islamic thought, both the kind of thought that we associate with Ibn Rushd and the kind of thought with Ibn Ghazali are not only possibilities. These are not possibilities, but they correspond to the teachings of the Quran. In other words, the Quran talks about so many things, and different minds are attracted to these different aspects of the Quran. This was the message of my book, the Quranic pictures of the universe. In other words, the Quran talks about the universe from so many different angles. It's as if that the Quran takes, if the Quran is a camera, it takes different pictures of the universe. So some scholars, some scientists prefer to study certain pictures, neglecting the other pictures, whereas another group of scientists prefer to study the other pictures. So the same thing, the question of the intellect, the relation of the intellect to revelation, for example. There are many different ways of looking at the relationship between revelation and reason. It's not just one way. So Al-Ghazali emphasized one way of looking at the relationship. Ibn Rushd looked at another aspect of that relationship. Now, there are different ways of looking at the relationship between creator and creation. Again, this is the problem. The moment we use the word creator, but this is English word. It's English word. So misunderstandings can arise because we are using English words whose meanings do not really correspond to what the Quran is using. Because when you see the word create, God create, God the creator, and creation. Well, normally, most of the time, people use the word khaliq, Khalq. But again, if you look at the work of Al-Ghazali, for example, his book, the divine names, the beautiful names, the divine names, then he will tell you there that khaliq, creator, there depends only to different aspects of creation, not creation from nothing, not creation from nothing as understood. Of course, philosophers and the Sufis understood nothing, that nothing, Adam as something doesn't mean nothing. Yeah, it doesn't mean nothing. But the creation ex nihilo of the exoteric theologian who said that nothing, still the point is the Quran does not use that word. Because there are other words the Quran uses to talk about creation, different aspects of creation. Bada, yeah. You can. It's it does not mean the same as khalaqa. Yeah. So khalaqa refers to a process of creation on something which already exists that is transformed into another thing. So it is different. When I'm saying that there's a need to be careful when we are speaking in English, we are discussing in English on concepts that use in Arabic, which can mean, and normally it means different things, or it conveys a wider meaning of words. So these are what I'm trying to say. Okay, let me see. Let me stop there so we can have some discussion on this. Let me just say this. Then within the large universe of Islam, of Islamic thought, Islamic ideas, both Al-Ghazali and Ibn were great thinkers. Professor Said Hussein Nasser used the word universal figures. These thinkers were the universal figures of Islam, meaning that they were knowledgeable in many different fields of study, different fields of knowledge. That was, in other words, they were both scholars of, they were philosophers, they were scientists, they were theologians, not just a few, but many of them. So within this universe, or within this intellectual universe of Islam, there are so many thinkers whom we can look upon as expressing the many facets of the truth of Islam. Islam is multifaceted. Some scholars, different scholars, deal with different aspects of Islam, but there were things that combined them, that united them, namely their belief. It is a certain belief united them. They all believe in the articles of faith. They all believe in the 5 pillars of Islam. But of course, when it comes to the interpretations of these articles of faith and articles, the 5 pillars of Islam, they are so many. They belong to different schools of thought. So there is both unity and diversity. And that is the beauty of Islam, that Islam emphasizes unity in diversity, from the one to the many, and from the many back to the one. So thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you very much, Jazakumullah khair, Prof. Osman. Alhamdulillah, unity in diversity, and is no showdown. And Imam Ghazali and Ibn Rushd live in 2 different times. So a lot of misconception. Alhamdulillah, we had good clarification and good, and we have a lot of questions too from the audience. And Prof. Osman, we have Dr. Omar Hassan Kasole from Uganda all the way. We also have the guest Tan Sri Ramli Ngah Khalid from Perak and or in Kuala Lumpur. And we have Cambodia and from all over the world. We have 221 participants now around the world.
Assalamualaikum.
Yeah. Tan Sri, yeah, you can. Tan Sri, you want to ask question? Maybe Shahran can unmute Tan Sri's mic. Shahran? Maybe I can, yeah, I can do that. Okay. Sorry, unmute. Tan Sri, can you unmute? Or anyone to ask question? Please unmute. Or maybe.
Hello.
Yes, Tan Sri, go ahead.
Yes. I just caught up with because there was a bit of hassle at the beginning, so I missed about 15 minutes of Professor's talk just now. Yeah. In the end, but I still was able to catch up one of the main themes of Imam Al-Ghazali, and that is with him and his alleged confrontation with Ivan Rose or Ivan Rush and Ibn Sina. It's true that that these critics look as if regarded as if all these 3 or 4 other philosophers, including, of course, Al-Ghazali, were living at the same time. I was also taken aback by these allegations, and when I searched further, I really found that they were decades apart, and it was not possible for them to confront each other during each other's time when each other was living. So one of the main aspects that people and intellectuals, some philosophers, I think especially from the West, came out with that with Imam Ghazali, the science floundered, and then he was more concerned with revelation, more concerned with domestic affairs, with more concerned with the domestic affairs of Muslims, rather than higher ethics and philosophy. And this seems to be the theme of attack, the core of attack by Western philosophers toward Imam Ghazali. And what I was about, in fact, I was trying to ask this question, this aspect of Ghazali's philosophy, but since it was just now explained by the Professor Osman, then I'm quite satisfied about it. So that actually is my comment on this matter at the moment.
Thank you, Tan Sri. Prof. Osman, you have any comment on that?
Well, thank you, Tan Sri. In fact, an easy way to refute those who make the allegation is for them to read Al-Ghazali's book, Mungkit Minadullah, which is available in both English and Malay. In English, called Deliverance from Error. It is clear that from that book, Al-Ghazali was having quarrel with the philosophers only in the area of metaphysics. He was not quarrel with scientists, with the philosophers on the question of the physical sciences, on the mathematical sciences. No, not on those. So when we say science, normally we refer to these two, mathematics and the physical sciences. These two groups cover what we today understand as science. But he was concerned with the philosophers' claim that they were able to establish their thesis, the certain beliefs, through the use of logic and reason. He was quarreling with that. For example, the question to show the eternity of the world, that not the issue. So it's different kind of thing. It's not with science. And therefore now to charge Al-Ghazali that is possible with science is to miss that point. Yeah. So just that, even if you want to be involved in this quarrel between Al-Ghazali and himself, just concentrate on those issues that he was talking about, not anything else. But now people generalize to make Al-Ghazali, look really, the person who's anti-science. But that's not the case. He was not anti-science. He was not anti-reason. He was critical of the position of the philosophers on certain issues. That's all.
Okay, Prof, I have two questions on chat room. One from Samsul Idul Adha. The question is, if Ibn Rushd is Ibn Rushd a representative of Athari or textualist school in his theological doctrine, especially in the book Kash Minhaj al-Adila and Al-Qaid al-Millah? This is the first question, Tan Sri, Prof. And then another question from Brother Nuruddin. Prof. Osman, please explain more about Ibn Rushd's criticism to Muslim philosophers in general. He said that Ibn Rushd felt that the philosophers had made a mistake in understanding Aristotle because at that time Aristotle's idea had been mixed with other ideas. So one of Ibn Rushd's important project is to purify Aristotle. This is another question. So I think two questions for time being.
Well, I mean, these are you have to understand when one philosopher criticizes another philosopher or non-philosopher, but on that very intellectual kind of issue, there's bound to be some differences. To me, the points that Ibn used reason, basically the methods of proof, is manahij al-adillah, the question of this referring to the place and use of logic, mantiq, and we must know that Ibn Rushd was a great follower of Aristotle in the art of logic. He considered himself as being truer than anybody else. In other words, he considered himself as the best of the Aristotelians. He was faithful to Aristotle more than anybody else. All right, I mean, there's no problem with that. If you want to make that, yeah. If he believes that Aristotle is really the person whom he should emulate, I think as long as the things he maintains are not contrary to the truth of Islam, there's no problem with that. What's important is generally speaking, not in detail, but in general, Aristotle was accepted very widely in Islam as a hakim, as one of the hukama, one of the sages. All right. So Plato, Aristotle, among the Greeks, were accepted by the Muslim philosophers, even by Al-Ghazali as theistic philosophers, meaning those who believe in God, those who believe in the last day, those even who believe in the divine laws, very much in the line with the Quran, the idea that each prophet has been given an aqidah and as a law, a sharia. Different prophets, different sharia. And so it's not against Islam. In other words, it is possible to integrate the thinking, the thoughts of Aristotle and Plato. Of course, but on details, you don't have to follow him. And this is where, for example, the thing about Muslim philosophers and scientists, while they call themselves the follower of Aristotle, meaning broadly speaking, they were free to criticize him on many issues, and that led to the new perspective on science. They were not merely followers of Aristotle. They criticized also Aristotle. Even Sina, he criticized Aristotle on many things, while being placed in the same school called the Aristotelian followers. So among philosophers, they also criticize each other.
Yeah.
This is normal. It's normal among the intellectuals, among the thinkers, that they also criticize each other. So I think not to be worried about that. But the point is, what unites? Yeah, despite these differences, there were principles on which they all agreed. Different principles. So I think there's been said that the differences of views among the ulama, among the scholars, is a kind of blessing to the ummah.
Okay.
What was the other question?
The other question, well, I have to okay.
The second question.
The second question is from Nuruddin. Is Too many questions. Yeah, it is. Prof. Osman, please explain more about Ibn Rushd's criticism to Muslim philosophers in general.
I already answered.
Yeah, okay. Then, so I open to the floor now, virtual floor. Any question? Can you raise a hand? And Brother Shahran will unmute. Radis Sapi, Brother Shahran, please unmute. Radis Sapi. Okay, sorry. Yes, Radis. So go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Because this is direct speaking to laptop. Prof, haven't seen you for a long time.
Yes.
People PKP. Assalamualaikum.
Salam.
Okay, Prof, my question is just this. Because I'm also interested in the sophistic world. During the time of Al-Ghazali, which is about what, 1058 to 1111, yeah?
Yeah.
That coincide also to the time of Sheikh Abdul Qadir Al-Jilani, who was considered the Sultan of Saints, which is around 1078 to 1065. Was there ever any encounter between them and any engagement in terms of knowledge? And what did the philosophers like Ibn Rushd lived later say about the knowledge, the sophistic knowledge of Sheikh Abdul Ghazali? Do they have any sort of engagement at all?
Thank you, Brother Radhi. Osman?
Well, I have studied the personal encounters between what was important was that is more in terms of the history of ideas, the kind of ideas that of course, I mean, the Sufism has existed long before Al-Ghazali, even at the kind of Sufism which involves conceptualization, philosophization. What you call just now, we are more interested to see what kinds of personal encounters, which I don't go into that.
Maybe they don't encounter each other, but the ideas, was there any engagement in terms of what, let's say, the knowledge as brought by Sheikh Abdul Ghazali? He had a lot of followers, thousands of people he converted in Baghdad. So there's got to be some sort of, even if it's not personal engagement, maybe some comments from the philosophers or Ibn Ghazali about that.
Well, we're talking basically about the Sufi school, about Sufism.
Yes.
All right.
Okay. I have two questions from a chat room. And also two person already raised their hand, Alvin Lingam. So I'm going to read the question in chat. Prof. Osman from Ali Nur Kadir. Prof. Osman, what is your opinion on the difference between Islamic metaphysics and modern metaphysics? This from Dr. Ali Nur. And from Prof. Rosnani Hashim, did the Minha during Khalifah Al-Ma'mun resulted in the conflict with the rationalists? And after his death and with the new Caliph, the philosophers were persecuted as this a consequence on philosophy in decline of science? There are two questions.
Okay. First, the metaphysics. There's it depends. But generally speaking, because you talk about modern metaphysics, you know what I mean? There are certain modern metaphysicians who are very much like the traditional metaphysician. But in general, there is a difference of, in terms of, certainly one difference is that Islamic metaphysics it talks about the science of God. In other words, the starting point of Islamic metaphysics is the knowledge of the divine realities, knowledge of God, which also discussed in the among philosophers, which basically the important to observe is this: metaphysics is about the science of the realities, which in theology, which is common to theology, okay? Theology is about the science of God. was the same thing as metaphysics, except that the metaphysics was used more by the philosophers, where in the case of the theology of God, let's say the theologians. So Islamic metaphysics was the branch of knowledge dealing with divine realities according to the philosophers. Philosophers use that. So who talked about Islamic metaphysics in the past? It was the philosophers. But then the philosophers belong to different schools. After Al-Ghazali, after Ibn Sina. Earlier, when you say philosophy, falsafa, it means the peripatetic or the followers of Aristotle. But after Al-Ghazali's attack on falsafa, on philosophy, new schools of philosophy appeared. The immediate one, of course, the school belonging to Surawardi, the school of the Ishrafi school, the Indonesians. And of course, where they differ is in terms of their methodological approach to metaphysics. But the principles of metaphysics discussed by the philosophers are the same principles which the theologians talk, which Al-Ghazali talks. All right? So it's just that different here in terms of terminology, but in terms of the truth themselves, they are the same, one and the same. But they are called by different names, and they are approached differently by the philosophers on one hand and by the theologians on the other. And this metaphysics has application to science, to physics, basically. Metaphysics has a very important implication for physics. But in the case of the modern understanding of metaphysics, is basically more kind of just philosophy, rather than metaphysics of the high order. They don't talk about the Godhead, about the divine attributes. They don't talk about the relationship between the divine attributes and the world of manifestation. So the word metaphysics used in modern context has lost its original meaning. It's just another. It's no different from philosophy, really. Okay. Now the other one, the question for Professor Rosnani, that is about the different scenarios or different impacts on philosophy as a result of the change of political power. Basically, that was that, Professor Rosnani. I think this was quite. It was, in other words, a regular thing. That's a feature. You know? In other words, patronization did influence intellectual life in Islam. So, in the case of Ibn Rus himself, he was one Al-Mansur, different Al-Mansur. This is talking about Spain, about Islamic Spain and Andalusia. Sometimes he was persecuted. Ibn Rus, his books were burned, but then he was later, in a sense, rehabilitated. Yeah, he found support again. This is a lesson for us. It's a good lesson for us that, in other words, to see that the development of knowledge in Islam also depended on patronization, and scholars have seen the light of day because certain good patronization, but at other times, in the case of the Mu'tazilite time, for example, some scholars were victimized, right? So that seems to look like to be the case. No, the intellectual life in Islam was dependent on the attitudes, of the rulers towards knowledge, and of course, in the case of philosophy, they also suffered the challenge from the ordinary, different from the school of ulama who are against philosophy, for example. So in the case where the rulers have to get the support of the ulama who are anti-philosophy, so philosophy has to take a second seat, as they say, the back seat, precisely because they don't have the support. So the fate of philosophy in the Islamic world has also been decided by the people in power.
Okay.
Can I just
a short one, Prof. Rosemary, go ahead.
make a clarification? What I mean is that during the Me'na, the Caliph Al-Ma'mun was on the side of the Mu'tazilah. They were arguing about that, about the Quran as makhluk, remember? And then Imam Hanbali was imprisoned and so on. All those who were against the idea were in prison. But then after his death of Al-Ma'mun, this new Khalifa now takes a side with Imam Hanbali, Muhammad Hanbali, and release him. And now they are persecuting the rationalists, the Mu'tazilah. And philosophers are belonging to that school. So they go into hiding, and that's why you have Ikhwan as-Safa writing without giving up their names because of fear of persecution. So I'm just wondering whether is that related to the persecution of the rationalists after that, and therefore then the decline of the rational and empirical science.
Okay.
Well, I think it's very important to qualify the use of the word. I said, be careful. The word rationalist. I mean, there's no one common understanding of this rationalist.
Okay, Mu'tazilah then.
You say rationalist. I'm not. Are you referring to the philosophers? Are you referring to the Mu'tazilah?
Mu'tazilah.
No, they belong to it. The Mu'tazilites are not the same as the philosopher, although they have something in common, but they are not identical in their views on many issues. All right, because the Mu'tazilites belong to the school of Kalam, not falsafa. Of course, among the people of Kalam, the Mu'tazilites were the most rationalistic of all, because in the sense that they put something to the point even of reason as above revelation. But not the philosophers. Yeah, so let's be very careful. Rationalists, to say that Mu'tazilites were rationalists and the philosophers can be confusing because here we have to look on what issue.
Okay.
Both emphasize the importance of reason, yes, but they have different kinds of beliefs. They uphold different doctrines. It's not the same.
Okay, thank you, Prof. I think we're going to finish at 10:30, but we have two already waiting to ask you a question. One from Alvin Lingam, another one from Nabil. I will ask brother Alvin Lingam to ask a question. You're from Indonesia? Where are you from, Alvin?
I'm from Singapore.
Oh, Singapore. Okay, Alvin, go ahead.
Assalamualaikum. Assalamualaikum, Professor Osman. Attended your session about 1 or 2 weeks ago. I have a more specific question. So basically the whole scholarship on this, we're talking about why the Muslim world lean more towards religious orthodoxy as opposed to a position of logic and rationality. So a lot of critique on the how the Muslim world developed post Ghazali, and then of course Ibn Rushd in his book Tahafut al-Falasifa gives specific rebuttals on certain arguments by Al-Ghazali in Tahafut al-Tahafut. So Imam Al-Ghazali specifically, he gave the example of the cotton and the burning of the cotton. He said, when you burn the cotton, you burn the cotton because of oxygen and fire, but Al-Ghazali said, in effect, the cause is God. Whereas Ibn Rushd said, no, you cannot say everything is attributed in this way to God because you have to give effect to reason. And this kind of arguments ultimately led into a situation where even the ulama start having debates about orthodox views on when is the sighting of Ramadan versus the purely scientific view where there's a conflict in the views, you see. So now, obviously Imam Ghazali had no chance to rebut Ibn Rushd, Tahafut al-Falasifa, because he would have died by then. Ibn Rushd was 10, 11 something onwards. He existed after Al-Ghazali died, and there was no specific rebuttal to Tahafut al-Falasifa.
Okay.
Everyone is wondering how Imam Al-Ghazali, if he were to rebut, whether there would have been a rebuttal.
Your question, Alvin, what's your questions?
So the question is, specifically, Ibn Rushd, the development of the Islamic world, if they had actually followed Ibn Rushd, would it have been different? And are we going more towards religious orthodoxy, or is there a misconception here?
Okay, thank you. And Brother Nabil, can you ask your question, Nabil? Go ahead. Nabil.
Assalamualaikum. Shukran, Professor Osman, for your presentation. It's much appreciated.
You in Malaysia? Where are you now?
I'm from South Africa, but my asl is from Malaysia. My forefathers are from there.
Okay.
So my question is, did Ibn Rushd, did he embrace to some degree the critique that Ghazali had of the Peripathic philosophers, in particular their misapplication of Aristotelian logic? And did Ibn Rushd, was he just merely a commentator of Aristotle, or did he critically engage and attempt to synthesize within the Islamic tradition as well?
Okay, thank you, Prof. Osman. I think you can answer these two questions, and can you conclude for the whole entire talk tonight? Thank you. Go ahead.
All right, thank you, Brother Alvin Lingam. Huh?
Yes.
Well, it's okay that the question that Ghazali did not have the chance to reply to Ibn Rushd. Why I say that? Because the issues that were involved are perennial issues, in the sense that this kind of issues basically is a confrontation, if I may use the word a bit strong there, between two perspectives. The encounter between two different perspectives that are always to be found in the minds of people at all times. In other words, it's not just a historical issue of the time. The issue between the two perspectives, one, the perspective to which Al-Ghazali belonged, that was the perspective, and the other one is the perspective that, which was represented by Ibn Rushd. Right? What are these two different perspectives? The question of looking at causality, basically. Yeah? Causality, the relationship between cause and effect. It all goes to the Quran, that's it. Now, both Al-Ghazali and Ibn Rushd were trying to defend the truth of the Quran, but different truths in the Quran with regard to the divine names, divine attributes. Al-Ghazali wanted to defend the principle of God being powerful. The attribute God is the all-powerful. God's will is infinite. God has will to do anything as well. And the emphasis here is that if you look at the arguments by Al-Ghazali, is that in the Tahafut, it's almost the idea of negating secondary causes in the name of the primary cause. Al-Ghazali wants to defend, or rather to safeguard the idea that God has power over all things. I think that is emphasized in the Quran. God has power over all things. God has, so, and therefore in this sense there, the arguments of Al-Ghazali, because want to emphasize the primary cause, negates or absorbs the secondary causes. He doesn't want to give a kind of and the role to secondary causes that exist in the nature of things. It is the nature, in other words, fire has a God-given nature, which is to heat, right? Fire heats. That is a nature given to fire. So when the Quran says, with regard when the enemies of Abraham wanted to burn him, all right, what did God say? God said, "Oh fire, cool, yeah, So God ordered the fire to cool. Why did God order the fire to cool? Meaning that the fire had heat. The nature of fire is heat. So and that's why he gave that order. So the point, Ibn Rushd was right to say that fire had this nature of heating. All right, but Al-Ghazali was not interested in that. Was interested that the ultimate cause, because to prevent people from only thinking about secondary causes, forgetting about the ultimate cause. I think that was the two perspectives. Yeah. The other one now, the question from
Nabil.
Yeah,
Nabil. Nabil.
Nabil, huh? Yes. About the I'm not quite really the question. What was this, Ibn Rushd?
Nabil, can you ask? Can you repeat your question?
Just please, to be precise, the question. What is the question?
Yeah, so I asked, did Ibn Rushd to some degree embrace Ghazali's critique of the peripatetic philosophers in their misapplication of Aristotelian logic?
Well, Ibn Rushd, if you look at his Tahfud, he was more interested in defending the perspective of science, all right? So from that aspect, he criticized Al-Ghazali. But I'm not sure when you want to say that the Ibn Rushd was appreciative of Al-Ghazali criticizing the peripatetic philosophers with respect to what? Can you give the example? It's not generally, but what was that?
Nabil? Okay. You still there?
Yes, I'm here.
What was the specific example that Ibn Rushd appreciated Al-Ghazali's critique of the peripatetics? Because remember that Ibn Rushd was one of the peripatetics. So then we say that there must be on some particular issue that he found himself to be on the same side as Al-Ghazali. Is that what you say?
No, not necessarily, because what I understand is in the Tahafut al-Tahafut,
yes,
is also critical of Ibn Sina's embrace of Aristotelian philosophy, that he wasn't fully embracing Aristotle, because Ibn Rushd, he was an Aristotelian in its true light, and in the same light, he also critiqued Ibn Sina because of his misapplication of Aristotelian logic. Yes. And he was trying to sort of defend Aristotelian logic to some extent.
Well, in details, yes, in details. In other words, in his commentaries on different books of logical rules of Aristotle, he has differed with Ibn Sina, for example, or Al-Farabi. So Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina, for example, although they consider themselves as followers of Aristotle, they do not follow strictly the logic, the logics of Aristotle. Starting with Farabi. Farabi was the first person to, in a sense, to depart from that.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Osman. I think we come to the end, and before I conclude, or maybe I just close the meeting, I would like to invite again Prof. Osman to say a few words in conclusion of the whole thing.
Well, thank you. I just want to thank all of you, and from different parts of the world who are listening to this. I think I just would like to invite you, I mean, to this thing, which is basically that we need a revival of philosophy in the contemporary world. I think we need to correct the misunderstanding, misconception about philosophy, the role of philosophy. It is very important to understand, to agree with Ibn Rushd here that there is no conflict between religion and philosophy, or between Sharia and philosophy. In fact, philosophy would be the kind of knowledge that will help us to understand the Quran better, in a sense. Yeah. So the Quran, the Quran will be better understood if we have philosophy. Without philosophy, our ummah will be in such a state that will not be able to be creative in knowledge. I think the positive place and role of philosophy in Islamic thought needs to be revived, needs to be represented, of course, in the context of the modern of the modern world, the contemporary world. Philosophy can address the challenge of the new knowledge that came from the West, for example. Without guidance from philosophy, the Muslims will always just depend on faith. Faith without knowledge will not save us. But knowledge without faith won't help either. So therefore, the unity of faith and knowledge, and that represented by philosophy, would help the Ummah out of the present situation. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.